Hello, my name is Alex Dmitrienko, and I would like to welcome you to this online training course on adaptive designs and clinical trial simulation. I will begin by telling you a bit about myself. I have over 20 years of clinical trial experience in the pharmaceutical industry. I have worked on hundreds of clinical trials. This includes early stage clinical trials, dose escalation trials, dose finding phase 2 trials, numerous registration quality or confirmatory phase 3 trials. And by registration here, I mean registration that would support regulatory approval for pharmaceutical products. I've also been actively involved in biostatistical research. I've published over 100 papers and several books on important topics, such as the analysis of multiple endpoints in clinical trials, subgroup analysis in clinical trials, innovative approaches to trial design, including adaptive designs. And I've also spent over 10 years working on software tools that support efficient clinical trial simulation with applications to clinical trial optimization. And we'll talk about the software tools we have built that will help you design advanced clinical trials with adaptive decision rules. It is my pleasure to present this online training course. It's a 10-part training course on the general topic of adaptive designs in dose finding phase 2 trials and confirmatory phase 3 trials. The main idea here will be to present key ideas behind adaptive designs in a more intuitive, more user-friendly, if you will, way, without overloading you with technical details, technical information, and I will be focusing on the most important aspects of adaptive trial design and most important considerations, including operational considerations. And we will go over the free open source software that you could use to design clinical trials that employ data-driven decision rules. For example, the rules for design modification at an interim analysis. I would like to add that I'm going to approach the topic of clinical trial design primarily from the perspective that reflects my own experiences in the pharmaceutical industry. For example, I've worked primarily on individually randomized trials sponsored by pharmaceutical companies. But the general principles, the general concepts I'm going to present in this online training course would definitely apply to a broad class of clinical trials that are designed by government as well as non-government organizations. And I will be referring to therapies throughout this training program, but once again, the same general framework would apply to vaccines and more general interventions, such as studies designed to assess the effect of various types of diets or supplements. I'm going to begin with a general outline. This and the next several slides provide a general overview of the topics that will be covered in this online training program. Roughly speaking, the 10 parts or 10 videos included in this training program can be split by topic as shown on the slide. We'll begin with two parts that provide a general introduction to adaptive designs. The next two parts, parts 3 and 4, provide information on adaptive designs that are employed in phase 2 trials. And the rest of the material, the remaining 6 parts, are devoted to adaptive designs that are employed in phase 3 trials. We'll discuss most commonly used, most popular types of adaptive designs, such as adaptive designs that support sample size re-estimation, treatment selection, and finally, population selection. This slide and the next two slides simply list the titles of the individual parts or videos included in this online training program. As I said a minute ago, we'll begin with a general introduction to adaptive designs, first in phase 2 and then in phase 3 trials. This will be parts 1 and 2. We'll then continue with a more in-depth discussion of issues, methodology, and operational considerations in the context of so-called response adaptive designs that are utilized in phase 2 trials. This will be part 3. And in part 4, we're going to continue this discussion, but we'll focus on a case study that will provide a motivation for the discussion of software tools that we've built and that you can utilize to help you design adaptive trials. Continuing to the next 4 parts, we're going to then proceed to a detailed discussion of statistical methodology and related topics in the context of adaptive designs that are used in phase 3 confirmatory trials. As you can see on the slide, we'll begin with a discussion of a class of adaptive designs that support rules for increasing the sample size. This will be part 5. In part 6, I will provide related information on the software tools that you can use to design clinical trials with this kind of decision rules. And then in parts 7 and 8, we will apply exactly the same approach to a class of adaptive designs that enable clinical trial sponsors to utilize interim information to support efficient identification of the most promising treatments. And finally, in parts 9 and 10, the same approach will be applied to yet another class of adaptive designs. These are the adaptive designs that are applied to so-called multi-population trials, and the interim assessments are used to select the most promising population or populations for the final assessment in those trials. So as before, we will begin in part 9 with a discussion of statistical methodology and general examples, and we will then wrap it up in part 10 by focusing on the issues related to software tools that are employed to support clinical trial simulation for this class of adaptive designs. The last administrative, if you will, comment I would like to make here is that multiple relevant resources can be found on the training program's website. This is the link you can follow to get access to those resources. On this website, you will find links to the clinical trial simulation software that we'll be referring to multiple times throughout this online training program, as well as other resources such as the references to all papers, book chapters, and books that will be mentioned in this training course. The first module in this training program is an introductory module that will be aimed at a general audience of clinical trial researchers. The other modules will be more technical. We will go over the underlying statistical principles, and we will discuss software-assisted design of adaptive trials that utilizes the software tools I have mentioned multiple times during this introduction. So this module will begin with a general introduction to adaptive designs, and I will then provide examples of adaptive approaches to designing phase 2 trials. Before we dive into the discussion of adaptive designs in clinical trials or in general studies, for example, we'll go over the reasons why they have become so popular. I think it will be important for us to understand key differences between the implementation as well as interpretation of adaptive designs in phase 2 and phase 3 trials. And as a quick disclaimer, In this training program, I keep referring to those as phase 2 and phase 3 trials, but honestly, this terminology is somewhat confusing, especially if we move beyond pharmaceutical drug development. And I think it would be more productive to use more descriptive terms, such as proof of concept trials for phase 2 trials that are dose ranging or dose finding in nature versus confirmatory trials that are phase 3 trials. These terms better describe the goals pursued in each class of those clinical trials, and I will try to use those more descriptive terms throughout this training program. So, what is the fundamental difference between the way we design adaptive trials in a proof of concept stage versus a confirmatory stage? The key difference here is that we apply hypothesis generating or signal seeking approaches in proof of concept trials, and in confirmatory trials, we adopt a hypothesis testing framework, which means that hypotheses that were formulated in proof of concept trials will be then tested in the corresponding confirmatory trial or multiple confirmatory trials, and which means that proof of concept trials are about exploring, describing, characterizing treatment effects, and confirmatory trials, by contrast, have fairly narrowly defined objectives, which is to test the predefined hypothesis. And then the main goal of a proof of concept trial will be to establish the proof of concept, which means to provide an overall dose response evaluation for an experimental treatment if it happens to be a dose finding study. For example, we could use it to characterize the dose response relationship, to estimate key characteristics of the dose response function. For example, we can use a proof of concept trial to estimate the target dose or a range of target doses that will be explored in subsequent confirmatory trials. And once again, when we now look at hypothesis testing approach in the confirmatory stage, confirmatory trials will be designed to facilitate the comparison of the individual dosing regimens or interventions versus the selected control arms. Now we are ready to get started with a general discussion of the role of adaptive designs in clinical trials. And we should first recognize that the landscape of clinical trial research has changed a lot over the past 20 years, and multiple innovative approaches to trial design have been introduced. And one of the most important new ideas is that of a broad class of general multi-stage designs. Those designs employ interim assessments, and those interim assessments are mostly unblinded, and those unblinded interim analyses are used to examine the emerging trends in the trial data that includes both efficacy and safety data. And then ultimately, those interim assessments enable the trial sponsor to modify certain elements of the trial design based on the accumulating data in the trial. For example, the trial design could be updated by enrolling additional patients, and in general, this class of designs is commonly referred to as the class of adaptive designs. And before we begin discussing the details and potential differences between adaptive designs used in proof of concept or confirmatory clinical trials, it will be important to go over the reasons why adaptive designs have become so popular. This applies to pharmaceutical drug development and a much more general class of studies that employ randomization, which are then randomized studies. And even though we know, again, going back to pharmaceutical drug development, even though we know that phase 3 or confirmatory trials can definitely benefit from the data collected in previously conducted trials, for example, proof of concept trials, it is still surprisingly very common to incorrectly size those confirmatory trials. And by that I mean incorrectly computing the required number of patients or required number of events if it happens to be an event driven trial, for example, a survival trial. And many trial sponsors end up going into the design stage of a confirmatory study with overly optimistic assumptions, and fairly quickly they may discover that they are at risk of failing because they cannot detect a meaningful efficacy signal since the trial was underpowered. In other words, the trial size, the number of patients was too small to reach the trial's objectives. And there have been multiple papers on this topic. That includes, for example, the papers that you see on this slide. And this body of research clearly indicates that underestimating the sample size is one of the leading causes of high failure rates in confirmatory phase 3 trials. And this is a major limitation of a traditional approach to designing clinical trials. And by traditional designs, I mean designs that do not employ any data driven decision rules. They do not learn from the data. Everything is prospectively defined within the traditional design framework, even though in reality we're likely to have limited information, or perhaps even no relevant information to properly choose the sample size or select other elements of the trial design. For example, the best, most relevant patient population for the upcoming confirmatory trial. And the good news here is that an adaptive approach to designing clinical trials helps us overcome those limitations of traditional trial designs because within the adaptive framework, there is no need to prospectively define each and every element of the trial design. We can update certain pre-planned, predefined elements of the trial design based on what we learn at the time of an interim assessment. For example, we could use the interim data to justify a decision to increase the sample size. And given the importance and, of course, practical implications of this class of clinical trial designs, there have been numerous publications that describe the benefits of an adaptive approach, and I will go over those fairly quickly. And adaptive clinical trial designs include data driven decisions, and by that I mean statistical rules that are used to perform appropriate design updates. For example, we can use, as I said, interim data to increase the total sample size in a trial or to drop ineffective trial arms. And those decision rules enable trial sponsors, or in general, when we think about general studies, general research teams, to design more robust and ultimately more efficient clinical trials or general studies. And a traditional approach to trial design that we sometimes refer to it as a fixed sample design because everything, once again, is fixed, it is set in stone. This traditional approach puts us potentially at a disadvantage because no data driven decisions are allowed. We cannot, once again, react to emerging trends in the data. And with an adaptive approach, we could rely on interim data to support pre-planned, pre-specified modifications that would help us ultimately improve the probability of success in the trial. And I would like to mention that an important component of this is also a funding perspective because adaptive approaches help clinical trial sponsors make the optimal use of the available research funds. For example, they support options to assess early signals of lack of efficacy, the formerly known as futility stopping rules, and those would be desirable from a financial perspective if a trial is unlikely to achieve its objectives at the final analysis. I will briefly mention that adaptive designs have been successfully applied to hundreds and hundreds of proof of concept or and confirmatory trials over the past 15 to 20 years. And also, if you include early stage studies or phase 1 studies, it will be probably thousands of trials that have taken advantage of an adaptive approach. And if we look at adaptive trials from the general healthcare perspective, it will be important to recognize that they truly help trial sponsors streamline the development process, and they help bring new therapies to patients or new interventions to subjects in more general studies. And this is done faster, more efficiently compared to a traditional design approach. And in this training program, we will go over multiple examples of adaptive trials that will help support this statement. The importance of adaptive designs in the context of pharmaceutical drug development has been recognized by regulatory agencies around the world. And I would like to, on the slide, mention two important regulatory guidance documents that were published by the United States Food and Drug Administration, known as the FDA. They published the final version of their guidance document on adaptive designs for clinical trials of drugs and biologics in 2019. And in addition to that, a European regulatory agency, the European Medicines Agency or EMA, also published a guidance document that was done earlier, back in 2007. This is a more general document that provides, is known as a reflection paper on methodological issues that arise in primarily in confirmatory clinical trials that employ adaptive designs. And it will be fair to ask about the key considerations for adaptive designs in confirmatory trials or phase 3 trials. I would like to point out here very briefly, and we will come back to those points multiple times throughout this training course, is that both regulatory guidelines, the guidelines published once again by the United States Food and Drug Administration and also by the European Medicines Agency, both of those guidelines emphasize that design modifications in adaptive trials must be pre-planned. And if you look at the definition of an adaptive design given in the FDA guideline, as you can see on the slide, the formal definition states that an adaptive design is defined as a trial design that allows for prospectively planned modifications, and these modifications pertain to pre-specified aspects of the trial design based on accumulating data from the trial. And both guidelines, I think, do a good job of driving this point home, and they state repeatedly that potential design modifications should be prospectively specified, and they should be clearly described in the trial protocol before the start of the trial. And we're going to come back to this point multiple times, that prospective specification of the decision rules applied at interim analyses in adaptive designs. And we'll keep saying that we design adaptive trials with pre-planned decision rules. For example, rules for enrolling additional patients or rules for identifying the most effective arms or dosing regimens at an interim analysis. And the guidance documents, of course, argue that adaptive designs provide a variety of advantages over traditional trial designs. This includes statistical efficiency. Specifically, they describe that with an adaptive approach, we can reach the same conclusions with the same level of confidence as in a traditional design, but we can accomplish this using fewer patients or subjects. And this is the point I made a few slides back, that adaptive trials tend to be more efficient than non-adaptive trials. and they ultimately help improve the probability of success for a given development program. And I would like to add that adaptive designs are also quite appealing from an ethical perspective. To give a quick example, adaptive designs, as we said a minute ago, they could incorporate futility assessments, and those offer the ability to stop a trial early if it becomes clear that the trial is likely to fail. For example, the experimental treatment that being studied in a trial is unlikely to be effective, and that means that from an ethical perspective, that the number of patients that could be potentially exposed to an effective treatment will be reduced. And the last point I would like to make on the slide is that the guidance documents also recognize that conducting an adaptive trial could be a fairly challenging task. There are multiple operational issues that we need to take into account. Those issues need to be addressed in any adaptive trial, especially if it's a registration quality or a confirmatory phase 3 trial. And very simply, again, we'll talk about this later in this training program, is that adaptive designs essentially create additional work for the sponsor. And that includes general logistical challenges related to simply the process of conducting interim analyses. An independent data monitoring committee needs to be set up. There are also additional requirements around firewalls to avoid dissemination of interim analysis results, to protect the trial integrity. Again, we'll talk about those important requirements in part 2 when we focus on adaptive trials that are used in phase 3 trials. In this section, we will talk about a popular class of adaptive designs that are used primarily in the context of dose-finding phase 2 trials or proof-of-concept trials that evaluate the efficacy and safety of multiple doses or multiple dosing regimens or interventions. It is the class of so-called response adaptive designs. The following study is an excellent example of a response adaptive approach to trial design. The I-SPY 2 was a very influential phase 2 program or platform. These days it would have been called a platform trial in patients with breast cancer, and multiple innovative ideas were introduced within this program. This slide provides only a very high-level summary of key concepts and ideas that were introduced as part of this program. And the key motivation was to understand the genomic basis for cancer and see how it could be used to develop more effective, safer, and potentially personalized treatments. This was accomplished through the use of efficient trial design as well as advanced statistical methodology. Specifically, Bayesian statistical methods were used in this program, and the ultimate goal of using this adaptive approach to trial design was to recruit fewer patients, but at the same time identify better treatment options and perform more reliable evaluation of biomarkers that could potentially help develop those tailored or personalized treatments. And when we think about the overall benefits of this approach, it was the introduction of innovative trial designs and statistical methods that could help clinical trial sponsors conduct more cost-effective trials and ultimately identify more effective treatments. This complex graphic gives a general idea of what the I-SPY 2 program was about, and it highlights key features of general trials with a response adaptive design. I know it's kind of busy, and I will quickly walk you through it. This is a visual representation of a dose-finding trial to compare the safety and efficacy of multiple drugs or perhaps multiple dosing regimens of an experimental treatment. If we look at the stacks of the individual blocks, each stack in this particular diagram corresponds to one of the new drugs that will be tested in a dose finding or proof of concept study. And each block here corresponds to either a patient or most likely a group of patients. A key feature of this particular traditional trial design, as shown in this diagram, is that equal numbers of patients are assigned to receive each one of the individual drugs, and the stacks are of equal height. And this approach needs to be contrasted with the use of random response adaptive randomization. And this is represented by the following two diagrams. Here we see that the stacks are of different height, and that is a reflection of the fact that here the randomization scheme is not static, it is dynamic, it changes over time depending on how effective each individual drug turns out to be, and as a result, more patients are assigned to more effective treatments. This diagram highlights key ideas behind the general adaptive approach to trial design, and in this case, the ideas to design a trial were the safety and efficacy data collected in a trial at certain interim points can inform the design of the rest of the trial. For example, as I said a minute ago, early efficacy signals could be used to assess how well the individual drugs perform in terms of their efficacy profile, in addition, in terms of their safety. For example, we can look at the benefit risk ratio for each individual treatment, each individual dosing regimen, and this information could be used to update the randomization scheme and increase the likelihood of assigning future patients to better performing drugs or regimens. And this feature is known as response adaptive randomization. It provides a foundation for response adaptive trial design that may be used in phase 2 trials. So this was a nice graphic, and it would be helpful to take a closer look at key features of this dynamic approach to randomizing patients to individual arms in a clinical trial that we refer to as response adaptive randomization. If we consider a typical dose finding trial or typical proof of concept study that is conducted to assess the safety and efficacy of multiple regimens compared to a common control, that common control could be placebo. Most commonly, at least within a traditional framework, an equal randomization approach will be utilized. This means that a patient has the same likelihood of being assigned to any arm in the trial, and which means that equal randomization ratios are used. This is sometimes known as equal allocation ratios. And by contrast, with a response adaptive randomization approach, patients are more likely to receive more effective dosing regimens. And from a practical perspective, a multi-stage design will be used. Patients in stage 1 will be equally randomized to the trial arms, and then starting with the next stage, which is stage 2, a response adaptive randomization is going to be applied. And that means that patient responses at the end of stage 1 will be analyzed, they will be processed to update the randomization scheme for the next cohort, and the randomization probabilities will be modified to ensure that more patients will be treated at the more promising regimens. And updates in the future cohorts will be guided by the same principle. They will be done in a similar way using the accumulating response data. Informally, these designs are sometimes known as play the winner designs. and I will give you an example later in this module. This approach, as we said before, in the context of general adaptive designs, is quite appealing from an ethical perspective, but there's also a pragmatic dimension. And from a pragmatic perspective, clinical trials with this adaptive feature, dynamic randomization or response adaptive randomization, are more appealing to patients because it will be generally easier to recruit patients and ensure their compliance with the protocol. We can go back to the FDA guidance on adaptive designs. The guidance document states that multiple rationales can be provided for trials that utilize response adaptive randomization. This includes statistical advantages. The general adaptive randomization approach leads to smaller sample sizes, which means the study will be shorter in duration, and at the same time, it is likely to result in greater statistical power compared to traditional design that relies on equal randomization of patients to the individual arms in the trial. Also, an important feature of this dynamic data-driven randomization scheme is that adaptive trials of this kind may be considered more acceptable to stakeholders compared to non-adaptive designs with a traditional fixed randomization scheme. And clinical investigators are more likely to embrace this type of adaptation because they know that patients are generally more willing to enroll in trials with response adaptive randomization features. These trials can increase the likelihood that patients will receive more effective treatments, and sometimes this probability of being assigned to an effective dose or an effective regimen can be substantially higher compared to the probability of receiving placebo. So, as I said a few slides back, this will facilitate patient recruitment and it will be easier to ensure that patients are compliant with the protocol. There will be potentially fewer protocol deviations. So, to summarize, investigator enthusiasm is important, and so is patient enthusiasm. They should not be discounted, and it's an important feature of clinical trials that rely on adaptive randomization. We're now going to go over a case study that illustrates the general response adaptive approach in a phase 2 or proof of concept setting. And we will go over some technical details as well as implementation details. This particular case study is based on a phase 2 trial that I worked on a few years ago. I was asked to help a client design a dose-finding trial that would take advantage of response adaptive randomization. Let's begin with background information and trial details in this phase 2 trial. The patient population in this particular clinical trial consisted of patients with partial responsive major depressive disorder, and the efficacy of the experimental treatment, and I'll tell you more about it in just a second, was measured using an endpoint which is commonly utilized in clinical trials for the treatment of major depressive disorder. It's the MADRS total score, which stands for Montgomery-Åsberg Depression Rating Scale, and it is evaluated at 4 weeks after baseline or after the moment when a patient is randomized to receive a treatment. From the trial design perspective, this was a 5-arm trial, as you see at the bottom of the slide. The experimental treatment was given in combination with ketamine, which is a by now well-established treatment for major depressive disorder. There were 2 experimental arms. The experimental treatment given at a single dose was combined with 50 milligrams of ketamine, and secondly with 100 milligrams of ketamine. Those combination arms were supposed to be compared with the active control arms, which were the same doses of ketamine but given as monotherapy, and the 5th arm in the study was a placebo arm. Here is some information on the multi-stage design that was employed in the study. Very quickly, this is how response adaptive randomization was implemented in this particular case. And I would say that this general approach is quite consistent with the response adaptive approaches in many other trials of this kind. Uh, Efficacy and tolerability data was to be reviewed on a regular basis using a series of interim assessments that were conducted at predefined time points, or sometimes this could be done uh, based on a predefined number of patients. This is how the milestones for the interim looks may be defined. The adaptive randomization approach was applied as shown at the bottom of the slide. In stage 1, as we said a few minutes ago, an equal randomization approach was utilized. At that point, we operate under the assumption that we know nothing about the efficacy profile of the individual arms, and therefore it makes most sense to assign patients to the 5 trial arms in equal proportions. And then at the end of each stage, including stage 1, the efficacy information based on the primary endpoint I defined in the previous slide would be analyzed, and that information would be used to update the randomization ratios for the next stage, which would be stages 2, 3, and so on. And when we update the randomization ratios for each new cohort of patients, we typically make sure that the randomization ratio and the placebo arm is fixed. Given that this is a five-arm trial, it would make most sense to fix that randomization ratio at 20%. Let me quickly walk you through an example. Once again, it is based on a real clinical trial. As part of that project, we put together a detailed summary of the operating characteristics for the proposed adaptive design based on extensive clinical trial simulation. This was a very comprehensive simulation report, and what I'm going to present to you right now is a numerical example based on that simulation report. I'm going to provide a visual summary of some of the key ideas that are presented on the previous slide. As we said at that time, this would be a multi-stage trial. And at the very first stage, which is labeled stage 1, an equal randomization approach would be used. And therefore, we assume, for the sake of example, that the sample size in the first stage is 50 patients, then exactly 10 patients will be allocated to receive placebo, and then subsequently individual doses of the control treatment, ketamine, as well as the combination treatments that are labeled here as combination 50 and combination 100. And then at the end of this first stage, the interim analysis data would be analyzed to update the randomization ratio to help assign most patients to the most effective doses in the next stage. And as a quick example, we can assume the following unequal randomization scheme. As you can see here, exactly 20% of the patients, or 10 patients, would still be receiving placebo in stage 2, and the numbers of patients assigned randomly to the other 4 trial arms would be updated based on the data that would be available to the sponsor at the first interim look. And we can see here that more patients are assigned to the combination of 100 milligrams of ketamine with the experimental treatment, while the combination of the experimental treatment with 50 milligrams in this case appears to be less effective, and therefore fewer patients would be randomly assigned to receive that. This general process would be repeated a few times, assuming, for example, this is a 5-stage study. The same principle then would be applied to the remaining 3 stages. We continue with this numerical example, and let us assume that the total sample size in a trial is pre-specified to be 150 patients, and a 3-stage design will be utilized in the trial. That means that there will be 2 interim analyses conducted The first one at the end of the first stage, and the second one, of course, at the end of the second stage. And the bullet points on the slide show us the total sample size at the end of each stage, which would be 50 at the end of stage 1, total sample size, cumulative sample size of 100 patients at the end of stage 2, and at the final assessment, all 150 patients will be included in the analysis. This and the next two slides help us understand how a response adaptive approach is applied to this proof of concept study. The table shows us the patient allocations for each stage in the study. In stage 1, an equal randomization approach is used, implying exactly 10 patients allocated to each individual arm in the study. When we continue to the next slide, a table on this slide shows us the estimated effect sizes or standardized treatment differences for the comparison of each experimental or combination arm to placebo. And of course, a larger value of the effect size indicates a more beneficial treatment. In this case, we can see that the effect size ranges from 0.31 for K50 up to 0.62 for combination 100, and this information will inform the design for the rest of the study. These estimated interim effect sizes will be fed to an appropriate Bayesian model to update the randomization ratios for the next stage of the trial. The randomization ratio in this case would be proportional to the probability of achieving target efficacy response, and that probability would be computed from the effect sizes that we presented on the previous slide. And based on those predicted probabilities of achieving target efficacy, we end up with the following randomization ratios for the second stage of the study. Once again, the proportion of placebo patients in this stage is fixed at 20%, and the remaining 80% of the patients are allocated in a way that reflects the available information on the efficacy profile of the experimental treatment in combination with ketamine. We are ready to wrap up this simple numeric example. This table shows us the numbers of patients that are allocated each one of the 5 trial arms in stages 1, 2, and 3. And we can see here how the randomization ratios are updated in stages 2 and 3 to once again reflect the emerging data on the efficacy profile of the individual combinations of the experimental treatment and ketamine. And as a result, if we take a closer look at the table, we will notice that most patients are assigned to the most effective doses, which are K100 and combination 100. So we're done with this quick numeric example, and more information on the response adaptive randomization will be provided in parts 3 and 4, and that would include the underlying statistical methodology, an introduction to clinical trial simulation, and we'll also talk about the software tool that we have built that will help you design adaptive trials of this kind in the proof of concept stage. And now I would like to call your attention to several key operational considerations for trials that employ response adaptive randomization. We're going to begin with the discussion of the role of patient enrollment in adaptive trials. And I would begin by saying that in general, when we think about a very broad class of adaptive designs, they tend to be most efficient when patient responses can be evaluated, can be ascertained fairly quickly relative to the length of the patient enrollment period. In this particular example, in this proof of concept study, the primary efficacy analysis was based on the change from baseline in the MADRS total score to the end of the 4-week treatment period. And the benefits of adaptive designs, which includes the specific case of an adaptive approach, a response adaptive approach, would be maximized when the patient enrollment period is much longer than 4 weeks. For example, could be 6 months. And what this means is that adaptive design will be most efficient if patient enrollment is relatively slow. If this is not the case and patients are recruited at a fairly fast pace, then we may run into the following situation. I'll just give a quick example that reflects potential problems that we run into when we have to deal with faster than anticipated patient enrollment in general adaptive designs. Let's say we collect all the data required to support a certain decision. For example, a decision to support the randomization scheme in a trial, but we may discover that by that point, most of the patients have already been enrolled into the trial, which would of course defeat the purpose of adaptation. So what do we do in cases when the primary outcome is slow to observe relative to the length of patient enrollment? In those settings, I would recommend identifying a relevant surrogate endpoint, a certain early readout, and intermediate outcome, which is strongly correlated with the primary efficacy endpoint, and it could be used to guide efficient adaptations in the trial. And this means that when we evaluate the potential advantages of an adaptive design, in each particular setting, it would be very important to model the patient enrollment process and understand quantitatively how quickly key pieces of information will become available to support those adaptive, data-driven decisions in the course of an adaptive trial. And this is exactly where a clinical trial simulation comes in, and we'll talk more about the role of clinical trial simulation in adaptive designs in this module, as well as throughout this entire training program. And along the same line, when we think about setting up the process to conduct an interim analysis and schedule a data monitoring committee meeting, we need to remember that time is of the essence here, and those DMC meetings need to be scheduled immediately after the end of each stage to minimize the gaps between the stages. If we're not careful enough, and there could be delays that happens in real life clinical trials, this will result in a larger number of so-called pipeline patients. This is a term that we use, and it's commonly used in adaptive trials to describe patients who are enrolled in the trial between the end of a stage where the randomization scheme should be updated and the actual time when that randomization scheme changes. And what happens here is that if there are too many pipeline patients, this is going to reduce the efficiency of an adaptive design. It creates kind of a blunting effect for the adaptive design. We're going to lose efficiency, and this is a very important issue, and we'll discuss it in more detail in part 3, where we'll go over the process of designing trials with adaptive randomization. We are ready to wrap it up with adaptive designs in phase 2 or proof of concept studies. What I've presented was a quick introduction to key approaches employed in adaptive dose finding trials or proof of concept studies. And this slide presents high-level conclusions. For example, the reason why response adaptive randomization is appealing in phase 2 proof of concept studies is because it enables the trial sponsor to assign most patients to the most effective doses, and as a result, there could be multiple appealing features here, including a pragmatic approach, as we discussed. From an ethical perspective, this is a very appealing approach, and from a purely statistical or mathematical approach, one of the key consequences of utilizing an efficient response adaptive randomization is that the precision of treatment effect estimates for the most effective doses will be improved compared to traditional design that employs equal randomization. And when it comes to sample size calculations, here we will have to rely on clinical trial simulation, just like in any type of a clinical trial that employs adaptive or data-driven features. And in this case, trial design parameters such as patient enrollment or patient dropout information and various other parameters such as the plausible treatment effect assumptions would need to be specified. Again, we'll talk a lot more about this in parts 3 and 4 and then later in this training program where we get to discuss how we can use the available software tools to facilitate the process of performing clinical trial simulation and designing trials that have adaptive features. Thank you so much for your interest in this online training program. Please watch the other videos in this 10-part program, and I would like to ask you to share information on this training program with your colleagues.